What if I told you that most arguments don't collapse because one person is smarter, but because one person knows how to ask the right questions? Not aggressive questions. Not emotional questions. But powerful, precise questions that expose the truth. Questions that leave the other person speechless, confused, or forced to rethink everything they believed. This is the secret behind one of the oldest and most effective techniques in human history, the Socratic method. In a world where everyone wants to be right, almost nobody wants to understand. We argue to win, not to learn. We defend our beliefs, even when they are weak. We repeat opinions we never examined. And that's exactly why Socrates, more than 2,000 years ago, created a method so simple and so effective that it can break down any argument, without shouting, without attacking, and without disrespect. His weapon wasn't strength. It wasn't dominance. It was curiosity, humility, and the courage to question everything, including himself. The Stoics later adopted this method because it aligns perfectly with their philosophy, to seek clarity, to challenge false impressions, and to remove emotional reactions from judgment. When you ask the right questions, you don't destroy the person, you destroy the confusion. You expose assumptions, contradictions, and illusions that people never noticed in their own reasoning. In this video, you're going to discover 5 Socratic questions that can dismantle any argument, not by humiliating others, but by guiding them toward truth. These questions are simple, but when used correctly, they are incredibly powerful. And once you master them, you'll never argue the same way again. Context: who was Socrates and why his method works? Before we go into the 5 questions, we need to understand why the Socratic method is so powerful, and the only way to understand that is to look at the man behind it, Socrates. He wasn't a king, a general, or a wealthy scholar. He was an ordinary citizen of Athens who walked through the markets barefoot, stopping anyone who would listen, or anyone who couldn't escape, to have conversations about truth, justice, virtue, and human ignorance. Yet this simple man changed the direction of Western philosophy forever. Socrates believed something radical. Most people don't truly know what they're talking about. They speak from habit, from emotion, from pride, or from social pressure. They repeat ideas they learn from others without ever examining them. And so Socrates dedicated his life to one mission, to test every belief through questioning. Not to embarrass people, but to help them see the gaps in their own reasoning. His goal was wisdom, not victory. What made Socrates different is that he never claimed to know anything with certainty. His famous declaration was, "I know that I know nothing." This humility gave him the freedom to explore ideas without pride, without fear, and without the need to defend an ego. He wasn't interested in proving himself right. He was only interested in discovering what was true. And because he asked precise questions, people would end up contradicting themselves, changing their position, or realizing that their beliefs had no foundation. This approach became known as the Socratic method, and it works because it reverses the flow of power in a conversation. Instead of you trying to prove the other person wrong, you guide them to examine their own assumptions. When someone reaches a conclusion by themselves, without being attacked, the impact is 10 times stronger. They see the flaw directly, and they cannot deny it. Centuries later, the Stoics embraced this method because it aligned perfectly with their philosophy. The Stoics believed that most of our suffering comes from false judgments, from reacting to impressions without questioning them. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca all emphasized the same idea. Question your thoughts. Question your beliefs. Question your reactions. This is why Socratic questioning is not just a debating tool, it's a tool for personal growth. When you challenge your own assumptions, you become calmer, wiser, and harder to manipulate. So when you use the Socratic method in an argument, you're not just repeating ancient philosophy. You're applying one of the most powerful mental tools ever created. It works because it forces clarity. It exposes contradictions. It removes emotional fog. And once clarity appears, the argument collapses by itself. Why arguments collapse? The Stoic perspective. Before you can use the Socratic method effectively, you need to understand why arguments fall apart in the first place. And this is where Stoic philosophy gives us a powerful insight. Most arguments are not logical, they are emotional. People rarely defend ideas. They defend their ego, their identity, their pride, and their feelings. When someone is confronted, they don't think, they react. And this emotional reaction makes their argument weak, inconsistent, and full of hidden assumptions. The Stoics called this problem, false impressions, the idea that our first reaction to something is often wrong, distorted by bias, fear, or desire. From the Stoic point of view, an argument collapses because 1. People don't define their terms clearly. They use vague statements like, that's unfair, everyone knows, or, that's just how things are. But when you ask them to explain what they mean, their reasoning begins to crumble. 2. People speak from emotion, not evidence. Anger, frustration, insecurity, and fear make people jump to conclusions. They react first, and think later. And when you gently question their claims, the emotional foundation falls apart. 3. People defend beliefs they never examined. Most opinions come from repetition, tradition, or social influence. People believe things simply because. That's what I heard. That's what everyone says. Or, that's how I feel. The moment you ask them how they know, the argument weakens. 4. People assume their perspective is the only perspective. The Stoics taught that humans are trapped in their own narrow viewpoint. We react to what we imagine, not what truly is. And when you ask someone to consider alternative explanations, their certainty disappears. 5. People confuse personal experience with universal truth. One bad event becomes, everyone is like this. One personal feeling becomes, this is how things always are. The Socratic method exposes this mistake instantly by asking for examples or evidence. This is why Stoics admired questioning. It cuts through emotional fog and brings the conversation back to clarity, logic, and truth. When you remove emotional reactions and force ideas to stand on their own, weak arguments collapse naturally. So the goal is not to win or to dominate the conversation. The goal is to help the other person see the limits of their own reasoning, peacefully, respectfully, and intelligently. This is the essence of both Stoicism and the Socratic method, calm questions that destroy confusion, not people. The 5 Socratic questions, main section. Question 1, what do you mean by that? This is the question that instantly exposes vague thinking. Most arguments collapse before they even begin because people use words that sound powerful, but mean absolutely nothing when examined. When someone says, that's disrespectful, this is unfair, he is toxic, or everyone knows this, it feels meaningful, but the statement has no precision. Socrates understood that if the foundation is unclear, everything built on top of it will collapse. When you calmly ask, what do you mean by that, you force the other person to define their terms. And the moment they try to define them, the fog begins to lift. Suddenly, what sounded like a strong accusation becomes a subjective feeling, an exaggeration, or something entirely different from what they initially claimed. This question also reveals hidden assumptions. For example, if someone says, that decision was unfair, and you ask what unfair means, they may realize that they never examined the standard they were using. Stoics believe that misunderstandings come from unclear impressions, so clarifying definitions is the first step toward truth. When someone is required to specify what they mean, the argument becomes grounded in reality instead of emotion. Many debates end right here, because once the person defines their terms honestly, they realize the situation isn't as extreme or simple as they first thought. Clarity destroys confusion. Question 2, how do you know this is true? This is the question that reveals whether a belief is based on evidence, or on emotion, hearsay, or assumption. Most people carry strong opinions but have no idea where those opinions actually come from. When you ask, how do you know this is true, you shift the burden of proof back to the person making the claim. Socrates used this question constantly because it exposes the difference between fact and interpretation. People often mistake personal feelings for objective truth. They confuse what they heard with what they verified. They repeat what others say without questioning whether it's accurate. When pressed for evidence, their confidence begins to shrink. This question works especially well in emotional arguments. Someone might say, "He did that on purpose," or "They don't care about us," or "This always happens." But when you ask how they know, they suddenly realize they're just guessing. Stoics warned against acting on impressions without examining them, and this question forces that examination. You're not attacking them, you're inviting them to think. And when they cannot provide evidence, the argument naturally loses strength. Truth does not fear questions. False beliefs do. Question 3, can you give me an example? This question cuts through generalizations and forces people to move from vague statements to concrete reality. Many arguments are built on broad claims: people are selfish, this system never works, you always do this, they are all the same. These claims feel true emotionally, but emotionally true does not mean factually true. When you ask, "Can you give me an example?" you push the person to leave the world of exaggeration and step into the world of specifics. Suddenly, their universal statement has to be supported by an actual situation. And often, they can only think of one example, or none. This reveals whether the argument is real or simply emotional. The Stoics taught that we should never judge based on impressions alone. Facts matter. Examples matter. Reality matters. And when someone struggles to give even a single concrete example, the entire argument falls apart. Even when they provide an example, this question narrows the scope of the discussion. Instead of arguing about a general principle, you can address one real situation. This makes the conversation more rational and less emotional. This question is powerful because it transforms noise into clarity. Question 4, what would change your mind? This is one of the most devastating questions ever created. It doesn't confront the argument, it confronts the mindset behind the argument. When you ask someone, "What would change your mind?" you're testing whether they are actually open to truth, or simply defending a belief no matter what. If the person cannot give an answer, or says, "nothing," it means they are arguing from emotion or ideology, not from reason. Stoics warn that people cling to beliefs out of fear, pride, or ego, not logic. This question exposes whether the argument is rational or emotional. If someone is unwilling to change their mind under any circumstance, then the conversation is not about truth, it's about identity. And no amount of evidence will matter. The argument ends here. But if they can answer and say what would change their mind, then the conversation becomes productive. Now, both of you have a clear standard for evaluating truth. This is the kind of dialogue Socrates loved, not a fight, but a search. This question shows whether the person is a thinker, or a believer trapped in their own narrative. It reveals whether the debate is worth continuing. Question 5, is your conclusion the only possible explanation? People often jump to conclusions. They interpret events in the most dramatic or emotionally satisfying way, even when many other explanations exist. The Stoics believe that most suffering comes from false interpretations, not from events themselves. This question destroys those false interpretations. When you ask, "Is your conclusion the only possible explanation?" you force the other person to pause. Suddenly, they see that what they assume to be absolute may only be one option among many. This creates space for doubt, nuance, and logic. For example, "He ignored me because he doesn't respect me." Possible alternative explanations: he was busy, stressed, distracted, or didn't see the message. "She said that because she hates me." Alternative explanations: she was tired, misunderstood, or expressed herself poorly. When people realize their interpretation is not the only one, their emotional certainty collapses. They can no longer defend a rigid conclusion. This is the essence of the Socratic method, creating doubt not by attacking, but by offering possibilities. This question breaks the illusion that one interpretation equals absolute truth. It opens the mind and deflates the ego. Real-life applications. Now that you understand the 5 Socratic questions, the real power comes from using them in everyday life. These questions are not just philosophical tools, they are practical weapons you can use to stay calm, avoid manipulation, and bring clarity to any situation. When you apply them correctly, you instantly shift the conversation from chaos to logic, from emotion to understanding. In friendships, these questions prevent unnecessary conflicts. When someone accuses you of something vague, you don't care, or, you never listen, asking, "What do you mean by that?" or, "Can you give me an example?" transforms a heated argument into a rational discussion. Instead of defending yourself blindly, you guide the other person to express their thoughts more clearly. In relationships, these questions reduce emotional reactions. Many fights happen because people assume intentions: "You did that on purpose, you said that to hurt me," or "You don't love me anymore." But when you ask, "How do you know this is true?" or "Is that the only possible explanation?" you break the cycle of emotional storytelling and bring the conversation back to reality. At work, the Socratic method helps you deal with unfair criticism or unclear instructions. When someone says, "This isn't good enough," asking, "What exactly do you mean by that?" uncovers the real issue. When a coworker spreads hearsay or makes bold claims, "How do you know this is true?" exposes unreliable information without confrontation. On social media, these questions protect you from misinformation and emotionally charged arguments. Online debates often rely on exaggeration, assumptions, and emotional narratives. Simply asking someone for evidence, examples, or alternative explanations reveals whether their claim has substance. And most importantly, in your own mind, these questions keep you rational. When you feel anxious, angry, or overwhelmed, apply the same method internally. Ask yourself, "What do I mean by this feeling? How do I know this thought is true? Is there another explanation?" This is how Stoics trained their minds to remain unshakable. The Socratic method is not just a way to challenge others, it is a way to challenge yourself. Stoic lessons you can apply today. The Stoics believed that wisdom begins with questioning yourself before questioning others. And this is where the Socratic method becomes a powerful daily practice. When you apply these questions inwardly, you start to control your reactions instead of being controlled by them. You stop jumping to conclusions. You stop assuming the worst. You stop letting emotions dictate your decisions. One of the most important Stoic teachings is, it's not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. This means that the stress, anger, or frustration you feel is not caused by what happened, but by the story you tell yourself about what happened. By asking Socratic questions, you separate the event from your interpretation. You challenge the emotional fog that distorts reality. When you feel angry, ask yourself, what exactly am I reacting to? When you feel anxious, how do I know this thought is true? When you feel hurt, is my conclusion the only possible explanation? These questions cut through exaggeration, fear, and negativity. They bring your mind back to clarity. Another Stoic lesson is humility, the willingness to accept that you may be wrong. Socrates lived by this principle. By admitting that you don't know everything, you open the door to learning, growth, and peace. You stop seeing arguments as battles and start seeing them as opportunities to understand. Finally, Stoicism teaches detachment from ego. You don't need to win every debate. You don't need to prove yourself. When you use the Socratic method, you engage from a place of calm strength. You are no longer reactive, you are rational. This is how you become unshakable. Conclusion. In the end, the Socratic method is not about destroying people, it's about destroying confusion. These 5 questions help you expose assumptions, challenge false beliefs, and bring clarity to any situation. When you use them with calmness and respect, you don't just win arguments, you elevate the conversation. You guide others toward truth instead of pushing them away. Socrates understood that wisdom comes from humility, not certainty. The Stoics understood that peace comes from clarity, not control. When you combine both, you become someone who cannot be manipulated, provoked, or deceived. Someone who responds with logic instead of emotion. Someone who chooses understanding over ego. If you learn to ask the right questions, you won't just change the way you argue, you'll change the way you think. And once your thinking changes, your entire life will follow.